Do you ever wonder if someone's really paying attention to you? Have you seen their eyes glaze over, but they're looking right at you? Well, this episode will answer some questions for you today. Hello, and welcome to Trial Lawyer Prep. I'm your host, Elizabeth Larrick, and we are going to jump right in. Today's episode, we are going to talk about attention spans. We have talked about this before, how that 8 seconds can cost you the verdict. I talked about this on episode 144, and you can get the link in the show notes. We know that people have trouble paying attention, and we talk about this often on the podcast. How do we keep people's attention? How do we use visuals? How can we help them in our organization? So today, I want to pass along something that I learned at Mark Lanier's Trial Academy this year. A fantastic CLE for any trial lawyer who wants to gain some new skills, learn the brain science, and just all around be a better lawyer. But every year I have attended, we've always talked about attention spans. And this year, of course, he tackled the topic, but really kind of blew the lid off a couple things that are total myths. And the first one is that attention spans are shrinking. So he took some time and made sure and showed us the resources that are out there that have said, okay, our attention spans are shrinking, we're worse than goldfish, when in fact, there is no research behind all that, total clickbait. Instead, he introduced us to this concept that has been talked about and coined in 1997 by Linda Stone called continuous partial attention, which basically says our brain has been conditioned over years of cell phones and notifications to be constantly scanning and looking for something more interesting, more urgent. And so our attention spans have been retrained. We still have short attention spans. Don't worry about that. That 8 seconds rule is not going away. We still need to be very cognizant about the first thing that we say. But this really helps explain a little bit more about what's going on when we see these glazed looks, right? So in the shorthand, it means we have continuous attention, right? Long, but it's very shallow, right? So when Linda Stone was explaining this concept in the Harvard Business Journal, she was talking about how people have their computer screens, they have all these different windows open, and they're constantly scanning them to pay attention to, the Word document, the IM messaging, all little things. And so it's constantly switching. And so I want us to talk a little bit more about what does this mean? Let's talk a little more in depth about what's happening in our brain, how this can be applied for what we do as trial lawyers, and then just a couple of wrap up before we close out. So let's talk about our brain. What is actually happening? So in another myth, if you didn't know this, which is brains cannot actually multitask. They can't do it. It's been totally debunked by science. And let me tell you a little bit about how they did it. So they used MRIs, right? And basically, of course, as you would think, experimented quite a bit with having people do different tasks. And they found that there was a bottleneck. The brain cannot carry out 2 cognitive demanding tasks at once. So while it may feel like you are doing 2 things at once, you are not. It just means that your brain is toggling between those 2 things. So think about driving and text messaging, or even just looking at your phone. You may still be driving, but you are not giving it full attention cognitive that it needs at that time. So when we're talking about toggling between switches, it actually is a huge energy tax on the brain. And so it really wears down very fast. And so when we have people losing that cognitive capacity, especially when we are teaching them things in our opening statement, they're supposed to be learning things from our witnesses, right? And they're watching, but there may not be a lot of cognitive synthesis going on with the information. So we really want to make sure that we do that. And that's going to move into my next point. But before we do, let's just talk about practical consequences of this continuous partial attention. So think about our jurors, they're sitting in there and they're going to get lost easily along the way. We typically have short opening statements, right? But think about those long expert examinations, right? Or even a longer opening statement. So they're going to be paying attention, but it's really shallow. That means they're going to get lost quickly, and you want to make sure they don't get lost further behind. We've talked about this as well when it comes to using simple words. When the brain runs into a word it doesn't understand, it stops at that word and starts trying to find an answer to it, which means they are not paying attention anymore to what you are saying because they're trying to figure out what the word means, right? And so we don't want people to be doing that. But let's just real quickly. So we know 1, brains cannot multitask. 2, attention spans are not shrinking. And that number 3, our brains have been rewired. So our attention has been rewired. We got long attention spans, but very shallow. So let's jump then over to how can we think about this for our cases. So while I know that we talk about trial a lot here, this also can be very helpful when you're thinking about a mediation presentation. Or if you're at a motion, you're going to be arguing. Everybody suffers from this. It's not just, somebody in Gen Z. Everyone has this now. We have been completely rewired by technology. So don't think that your judges or your mediators don't have this rewiring as well. So a couple really quick things that you can do when you're thinking about presentations that may be a little bit longer. Number 1, we always want to be organized and say our organization to our listeners. And we always want that to be simple organization. We've talked about this a couple of different ways that you can do that. The grouping that is always suggested is groups of 3s. And that's really about what our short working memory can handle. But we want to also be telling our audience about our organization. Number 2, we want to use visual aids to help us explain our concepts, not to just repeat it. So again, thinking about our listeners may get lost along the way. And so if they're giving their attention back to you and you've got a slide that's got a bunch of words on it and they're having to now cognitively read all that, and then you change the slide, now we're back at the same problem. So we always want our visual aids to act as re-entry ramps, right? To help them easily gain back into the presentation to know where you may be. So if they glance at a foam board, they glance at your notepad or glance at the Elmo or the IPVO, they're pretty much instantly back onto the concept that you're talking about. They're not going to be completely lost. And also the visual, if it's like we talked about, if it's too busy, it's going to, again, get them lost. And if you change the slide, then they're lost again. So we want to use easy visual aids to bring everyone back into the conversation or keep people in the conversation, if you will. And the last thing would be, again, giving anchor phrases, right? Which would be basically you're going to give the concepts again. And this is, again, where we want to make sure we're using organization, but we're also going to be reviewing that again and giving it back to people to make sure they're with us. If you miss it the first time, you're going to get it the next time. This also really helps when you are making presentations for focus groups because we typically have a shorter amount of time, but we have a lot of information to get through. And that's where when we do presentations, and I work with lawyers in focus groups, which is mainly what I do, we work very hard on your presentations to make sure that they're fitting our attention spans. They're keeping people on target for what we're talking about so that we can have a good discussion, get into that cognitive thinking and that synthesis that we want from our focus groups. All right, so a quick turnaround on this episode, but just in case, right, we know attention spans are not getting shorter. They're just being rewired. They've been retrained by technology. We want to know that. We want to make sure we build our presentations for whatever it may be. Maybe it's the courtroom, it's a hearing, it's mediation. We want to make sure those things are organized and that we say our organization. We want to make sure we're using visuals to amplify, not repeat our concepts. And then also just always keeping in mind that re-entry, right? People are going to get lost. It's okay. They will, but you're going to bring them back in easily and quickly with entry and re-entry points where you're going to be either repeating the concept or showing a visual for that. If you haven't listened to episode 144, our 8-second rule that could cost you verdicts, I encourage you to do that. The link will be in the show notes. And until next time, thank you so much for listening to Trial Lawyer Prep. Keep on prepping to win.